On this episode of Assignment Discovery, travel across the Atlantic on the slave ship Amistad. Learn how kidnapped Africans became enslaved, then defended their freedom by starting a mutiny on board the small schooner. Journey from Africa to Connecticut and see how they gained their freedom in court with the help of the United States President John Quincy Adams. Coming up now, study and discussion questions for Slave Ship, Part 1. What was the Middle Passage? What were the three major items used by European traders as payment for slaves? Discuss the conditions and common practices aboard a typical slave ship bound for the Middle Passage. Then contrast the philosophies of loose packers and tight packers. Assignment Discovery now presents Slave Ship, Part 1.
Squeezed into the cramped hold of a slave ship, a young African captive named Singbe Pie would win a once-in-a-lifetime chance of returning to his homeland. What Singbe was about to attempt had never been accomplished in the brutal history of transatlantic slave ships. Yet the actions he set in motion would capture the attention of an entire nation. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most profitable businesses in the world. For nearly 400 years, almost everyone involved made a fortune from the misery of people whose names remain forever lost in time. Slave ships made roughly 39,000 voyages from Africa to the Americas. They were instrumental to the birth of commerce and wealth in the New World. Few cared about the millions of African men, women, and children shipped across the Atlantic to fuel that commerce with their labor in the largest forced migration in human history. Singbe was kidnapped from his home only 3 months earlier. He could still see the death march, and he could never forget being swallowed by a huge ship that hauled him for weeks across so very much water. When the ship finally reached land, Singbe was purchased by a white man. Now he was on another ship, bound for the white man's plantation. And frantic rumors were being whispered in the hold that once they arrived, the white man would kill and eat the Africans. For Singbe, a desperate chain of events began with the discovery of a single broken nail. He used the nail to break free of his shackles. Singbe Pie would attempt to win back his freedom by using the only option left open to him: violent rebellion. Between 1699 and 1845, there were over 150 documented mutinies aboard slave ships. Many of them were recorded in Lloyd's List, the London Shipping Report. But throughout the entire history of the slave trade, Africans successfully mutinied in America and returned to Africa in freedom exactly once. June 1839, aboard the Cuban merchant schooner called Amistad, the Spanish word for friendship. The leader of the revolt was Singbe Pie. Singbe was born in the country of Mendi, now part of present-day Sierra Leone. He had been kidnapped from his home and sold to a Portuguese slave trader in West Africa. He was then sent to Cuba aboard an illegal Portuguese slave ship.
Cuba was not supposed to have slaves at all, but because the governor of Cuba was avaricious, he allowed slaves in the city if he was given a little money for each slave that was brought in.
Warren Marr is a writer and historian. He is also deeply involved in the construction of a full-size replica of the Amistad being built at Mystic Seaport, Connecticut.
Singbe's real name was Singbe Pie, but his captors couldn't say it, and so they changed it to Sinkay.
It was by the name Joseph Sinkay that Singbe Pie would become known to history. Don Jose Ruiz, a young Spanish dandy, bought Sinkay and 48 other Africans at the Havana slave market. Ruiz's older friend, Don Pedro Montes, purchased several children. Together they commissioned the schooner Amistad to ship the 53 Africans to their plantations near the Cuban town of Puerto Principe. Jeffrey Bolster is an assistant professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. He is also an author and a licensed tall ship master.
The Amistad was a little coasting schooner working the north coast of Cuba. She was not as well equipped, as well armed, or as heavily manned as a slave ship would have been in the deep sea trade. And that's in part how the Mende captives there were able to seize the ship.
In addition to Ruiz and Montes, there was a crew of 5, consisting of the ship's captain, Ramon Ferrar, 2 sailors, and the captain's 2 slaves who worked as cook and cabin steward.
The Cuban sailors let down their guard. They were a little complacent, a little cavalier. Sinkay found a piece of metal with which he was able to undo his shackles. Someone had made a colossal mistake, which was to leave a bunch of cane knives or machetes in the hold of the ship where they put the slaves themselves.
The ship's cook had joked with the captives that the Cubans were planning to eat them. And they took the joke as a deadly threat. One by one, they followed Sinkay out of the hold and onto the main deck. The ship's small crew had no idea that the Africans were armed and ready to attack, until it was too late. When the Africans confronted the Cubans, they hesitated, unsure what to do. The Amistad's captain, Ramon Ferrar, ordered his cabin steward, Antonio, to throw bread at the Africans, hoping the food would appease them. Then Ferrar made an arrogant, fatal decision and set off a battle. In the struggle, the Africans killed Captain Farrar and the mulatto cook. Ruiz and Montez were captured by the Africans. The cabin steward translated the Africans' ultimatum. Montez must take the ship back to Africa if he expected to live. The Amistad Mutiny would have repercussions that would eventually extend as far as the United States Supreme Court and pit two American presidents against each other.
Cinque must have been an amazing inspiration, a marvelous hero, to have escaped once from enslavement via a mutiny, using a boat that he didn't know anything about, on an ocean he didn't know very much about, and then that he could escape, essentially, from the American legal process that had enslaved African Americans. That's a miracle.
There is no doubt that the outcome would have been different had Cinque and his people attempted a revolt aboard a fully manned transatlantic slave ship. Very few captives ever dared mutiny once a ship left Africa on the infamous voyage of violence and death, known in the trade as the Middle Passage. Cinque and his people were captives on an undermanned coastal merchant schooner. The odds that they could have overpowered the well-armed crew of a transatlantic slaver were virtually non-existent. On those ships, captains and crew never let their guard down.
These ships were armed camps. These ships had a massive security problems because Africans did not go willingly into their slavery.
The Africans' desperation and hopelessness meant that security problems persisted throughout the Middle Passage, the major leg of the Great Triangular Slave Route. It was the route followed by the slave ships across the Atlantic to the Americas. Most of the ships transported Africans from the coast of West Africa to Brazil or the West Indies. Only about 5% of their human cargo came to the United States. A typical slave ship could make the Middle Passage in 5 to 12 weeks. For the traders, the formula was simple: cramming as many Africans as possible into a ship and then delivering them to market alive equaled the greatest possible profit. But that was also the traders' dilemma. How could they best bring the Africans across alive?
The mortality was high. 15-20% was not uncommon for people to die on these passages. Some entrepreneurs thought the more we cram aboard the ship, the more we're going to have to walk off on the other end. They were the tight packers. Others said, if you treat these people a little bit better, they're more likely to live. We're going to cram fewer into a ship. They were the loose packers. Slaves shackled together below decks often had no more than about 24 inches, with very little room and often lying in their own filth because of the way that they were shackled together.
The British slave ship Brooks broke all known records in tight packing by jamming 609 Africans in a ship meant to hold 300. Some scholars now believe that whether a ship was loosely or tightly packed made no appreciable difference in the Africans' mortality rates.
The ship we're aboard was built in 1841, but a lot of the construction details are similar to the slave ships. Clearly, the overhead is low. You have to crouch to get through here, but it was even worse than that. Oftentimes, the 'tween decks of a ship like this was partitioned so that 2 tiers of slaves could be packed aboard, chained to each other, not only suffering the indignity of not being able to sit up, but their flesh rubbing against the rough sawn planks of the ship itself.
The hardships suffered by the Negroes during the passage are scarcely to be conceived. Dr. Alexander Falconbridge, ship's surgeon.
Falconbridge practiced on board British slave ships In 1788, he wrote about becoming physically ill after spending only 15 minutes in a slaver's hold.
When I had to enter the slave deck, I was forced to crawl over the slaves. The Negroes are frequently packed so close together that they have not so much room as a man in his coffin. I was so overcome with the heat, stench, and foul air that I nearly fainted. It was only with assistance I could get on deck.
Hundreds of Africans were forced to use 3 or 4 large buckets as toilets.
Our wretched situation was aggravated by the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and almost suffocated. O lauda Equiano.
The intense body heat created a thick, wet steam that hung in the air like fog. The stench often preceded them into port. Despite the despicable conditions, these floating bits of hell were called by the gentlest of names.
The names that captains and merchants gave to their slave ships make us understand a little bit about their perception of slavery. Most of us would be aghast at the thought of naming a slave ship for our mother or our wife, the Betsy, the Polly, the Charming Sally. Most of us would think it was a cruel trick indeed to name a slave ship the Olive Branch, or the Dove, or the Liberty.
The most ironic of all was an American slaver simply called Hope. When weather permitted, the Africans were brought onto the main deck, where they were forced to dance. Dancing, it was thought, would help keep them alive. Those who didn't dance heartily enough were flogged. To escape the brutal conditions, some Africans chose starvation. The slavers simply used a device called the speculum oris to change their minds. Former slave Olaudah Equiano described how Africans, desperate to escape the ships, took their own lives.
2 of my wearied countrymen, preferring death to a life of misery, jumped into the sea. There was such a noise and confusion among the people of the ship to get the boat out and go after the slaves. However, the wretches drowned. Olaudah Equiano.
No one will ever know how many Africans died during the savagery that was the Middle Passage. But scholars now suggest that despite high mortality rates aboard the ships, many more captives were likely killed before ever leaving the continent of Africa. Aboard the Amistad, Singbe-Pied freed himself and others by fighting the men who tried to enslave him. Another African, Olaudah Equiano, won his freedom by joining his enslavers. The slave Equiano became so successful as a slave trader, he was allowed to keep a small share of the profits for himself. Within a few years, he saved enough money to buy his own freedom. He later wrote a successful autobiography exposing the inhumanity of the slave trade. The story began with Equiano's own kidnapping at the age of 10 from his home in what is present-day Nigeria.
One day when all our people were gone out to their work, only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house. 2 men and a woman got over our walls and seized us both, without giving us time to cry out or make resistance.
Kidnappings like Equiano's were common long before the Europeans arrived in Africa.
People became slaves mostly through violence, through war, through kidnapping, through very specific raids that were designed to enslave people.
These were very different groups of people in their own eyes who spoke different languages, who had different customs, and who didn't see each other as brothers, who saw each other as sometimes rivals for the same territory, rivals for hegemony, rivals for power.
When in 1517 the Europeans first came trading for slaves, the Africans had a ready-made product.
Europeans fitted themselves into existing trading patterns along the African coast, and then gradually, as the slave trade became more important, came to dominate the slave trade as a whole.
The men who were most wanted as slaves were, of course, men who were in the prime of life, teenagers, men in their 20s. They were strong and they were angry.
Some African kings distrusted the Europeans. They refused to take part in the slave trade.
African monarchs at times did expel European slavers. A few African states actually banned the slave trade, and particularly the sale of slaves to Europeans. The Kingdom of Benin, for example, at one period banned the export of any male slaves. And since male slaves were the principal slaves that were desired by Europeans for working on plantations, this effectively killed the trade from the Kingdom of Benin. It was intended to, and it did do that.
Other African rulers and merchants fought vicious battles against the Europeans for control of the trade. But most monarchs echoed the opinion of one African ruler who declared to a European slaver,
"We want 3 things: powder, ball, and brandy. And we have 3 things to sell: men, women, and children."
Traders exchanged a variety of goods for human merchandise. But cowries, small seashells indigenous to the Indian Ocean near the Maldive Islands, were the currency of choice. Muslim merchants brought the shells to West Africa to exchange for African goods and slaves. As currency, cowrie shells were traded by the bag. A trader could pay as much as 40,000 shells for a single African. Hauling shiploads of seemingly worthless shells in order to buy slaves was a large inconvenience for European traders, but they had little choice in the matter. European money meant absolutely nothing to African slavers.
When you look at currency, even in today's society, it's only paper with print on it. It's green paper. Anyone coming into our society today would say we are able to achieve and acquire huge amounts of materials with green paper.
As profits increased for both Africans and Europeans, slavers increased their raids on villages. The west coast of Africa, from Senegal in the north to Angola in the south, was so thoroughly covered by slave traders that entire populations moved inland. But the slavers only followed them deeper into the African interior.
The slaves came from all different parts of West Africa. Early on in the slave trade, they came from relatively near the coast. Later, they would be marched sometimes for 2 or 3 months from inland.
No one was safe from the slave traders.
Was blind, but now I see.
Coming up now, answers to the questions for Slave Ship, Part 1. The Middle Passage was the route followed by slave ships across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. Gunpowder, brandy, and seashells were the 3 major items used by European traders as payment. Try this activity with your class. Have students research John Greenleaf Whittier and the Anti-Slavery Society. Then have them write a poem expressing their views on slavery and exposing the horrors that took place below the decks of a slave ship. To learn more, members of the American Association of School Librarians, ERIC, and Assignment Discovery suggest The First Passage, Blacks in the Americas by Colin A. Palmer. Log on to school.discovery.com for curriculum materials and resources to complement Slave Ship. Coming up now, study and discussion questions for Slave Ship Part 2. How did the European factors participate in the transatlantic slave trade? What was the significance of the United States Supreme Court decision regarding the Amistad Affair? Discuss the statement, slaves became more valuable than gold. Then explain how and why Africans participated in the enslavement of their own people. Assignment Discovery now presents Slave Ship Part 2.
No one was safe from the slave traders. Those who survived were sold to African or European middlemen known as factors.
The European factor would work on the coast. He would be the middleman, the exchange merchant who would arrange to buy the slaves in exchange for other goods.
Waiting for the ships, factors would accumulate hundreds in their compounds.
The compounds where slaves were kept were called factories, but they weren't manufacturing anything. They were more like holding pens.
One African monarch controlled a compound with factories for 4 separate nationalities: France, England, the Netherlands, and Portugal. In 1481, in a fishing village off the coast of Guinea, the Portuguese built Elmina, a massive fort, intended to guard gold and ivory shipments from West Africa to Lisbon. But then in 1517, Spain commissioned Portugal to deliver the first African slaves to the Spanish New World in the Americas. In time, slaves became more valuable than gold. Instead of guarding gold and ivory, Elmina's high, thick walls, its sun-baked courtyards, and its massive bullion cells were converted into pens and dungeons for holding captured Africans. Yet, in spite of possessing a fort as imposing as Elmina, Portugal had very little influence over the African elites, the powerful kings and rich merchants who controlled the slave trade.
Europeans operated in Africa at the sufferance of African elites. European power really didn't reach any farther than a European gunshot. So that had African elites not been interested in selling slaves, had African elites not been interested in allowing Europeans to set up slaving operations on the coast, they never could have done it.
When the ships finally did anchor, the captured Africans were quickly loaded aboard. At times, Europeans would risk their lives and livelihood to kidnap Africans without permission.
When a ship didn't fill its hold with enough bodies, and it really had to sail quickly, it was common for the ship captain to send a small boat upriver somewhere and just try to kidnap a few people to make up the hold, if they could get away with it. This was the constant battle that went back and forth between local authorities and European ship merchants, because the ship merchants wanted to come back to the same place year after year and do business. And if you did that, you obviously couldn't be involved in kidnapping and illegal actions. But I have to emphasize that the overwhelming majority of slaves were still supplied through African middlemen from wars that had nothing to do directly with European involvement at all.
In the beginning, the transatlantic slave trade was the exclusive monopoly of Portuguese slavers who dominated the west coast of Africa. But during the 1600s, the Portuguese monopoly came crashing down. The ubiquitous wars that raged through Europe during most of the 17th century were fought not only for territory and power. The battles determined who would dominate the New World. and control the African trade.
Those wars overwhelmingly resulted in British domination because it was England's mastery of the sea, which was particularly clear in the 18th century, that enabled Britain really to dominate the slave trade as a whole.
Britain turned the slave trade into an industry. Its ships alone carried an estimated 3 million Africans to the Americas. But there was still plenty of opportunity for France, the Netherlands, and virtually every other major country in Europe to take part in the trade. By the 1700s, money from the trade helped build the cities of Liverpool and Bristol in England, and the French city of Nantes, all of them participating in a great triangle of profit.
The triangular trade is a phrase that's used to emphasize the link between Africa, the tropical Americas, and Europe, hence the triangle. Goods, commodities are shipped from Europe to West Africa to buy slaves. Slaves are taken to the Americas to grow sugar. Those crops are then shipped to Europe, where they're manufactured for re-export to Africa to buy slaves. That's the idea of the triangular trade.
The responsibility of transporting hundreds of Africans to slavery in the Americas rested solely on the shoulders of the slave ship captains. They held the ultimate power to do whatever was required to bring their human cargo to market at a profit. Luke Collingwood may have been the worst slave ship captain of them all. Collingwood was master of the British slaver Zong. In 1781, the Zong was nearing the island of Jamaica, but was almost out of drinking water. Fearing most of his cargo would die before the Zong reached Kingston, Collingwood decided to collect the insurance money on his captives. He gave the order to jettison 132 sick or weak Africans. News of the Zong atrocity reached England through the efforts of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano was living in England and had heard of the massacre from old contacts in the trade. He exposed the incident to British abolitionists in hopes of finding justice, and his actions helped jumpstart England's anti-slavery movement. The owners of the Zong were brought to trial for insurance fraud.
I object. There was no evidence that Negroes were thrown overboard after the rain.
That evidence is here, in the transcript of proceedings.
For the first time, the British people learned about the real horrors of slave ships. They were shocked and outraged. One of the men who spoke out loudest in condemning the Zong atrocity was British clergyman John Newton. Newton had first-hand knowledge about the brutality on slave ships because he had once been a slave ship captain himself.
John Newton has come down to us as a man who, late in life, found his conscience and began to look back on his former life as a slave ship captain with a degree of contrition, a degree of regret, a degree of self-loathing.
Newton became a prominent church minister whose fiery sermons lashed out against his former trade.
Custom, example, and interest had blinded my eyes. I should have been overwhelmed with distress and terror if I had known or even suspected that I was acting wrongly.
In 1779, Newton authored the hymn Amazing Grace. Perhaps he wrote it as his plea for forgiveness from the people who suffered and died aboard his slave ships.
Blind, but now I see.
With pressure building from John Newton and other abolitionists, both Great Britain and the United States banned the slave trade on January 1st, 1808. Passage of the ban brought a standing ovation in the British Parliament for William Wilberforce, who had labored for over 20 years to abolish the slave trade. Although importing slaves had been declared illegal in the United States, the institution of slavery was alive and well. In 1820, Spain also banned the African slave trade in Cuba and her other American possessions. But by the time Cinque took control of the Amistad, nearly 20 years later, renegade captains were still bringing illegal shipments of Africans to the Americas as slaves. Yet Cinque had accomplished the impossible. He commandeered the slaver's own vessel. For 2 months, the Amistad wandered on the waters just off the coast of the United States. Several Africans had died from illness or dehydration. Instead of sailing for Africa, the Amistad was slowly being pulled northward by the powerful currents of the Gulf Stream. In the summer of 1839, newspapers along the eastern seaboard of the United States reported wild stories of a mystery schooner prowling the coast manned by roving black pirates. But the Africans aboard the Amistad who unknowingly caused the panic were having worries of their own. Cinque desperately needed to find food and water. He anchored the Amistad off Culloden Point at the northeast tip of Long Island, New York. The United States surveying brig Washington came upon the Amistad and seized it as a pirate ship.
The Africans and the Amistad were taken into custody, towed across Long Island Sound to New London first, and then to New Haven, where formal charges were launched against them in the courts of Connecticut.
Spain demanded that President Martin Van Buren return the Africans to Cuba. Van Buren agreed to the Spanish demand secretly. But then the media of the day got hold of the story. The mutiny was sensationally depicted as a huge battle royal between Africans and Spaniards. The Africans became celebrities. Cinque himself was the subject of a heroic painting that portrayed him as a godlike African prince. Northern abolitionists came together to champion the Africans. It was an opportunity to draw public attention to their radical views against slavery.
The Amistad affair did mobilize people. It did provide a cause which could bring the abolitionists in the United States in particular together. So therefore it was a focal point at a very crucial time in the development of the abolitionist movement.
Noted abolitionist Louis Tappan put out a call for public support to provide a defense fund for Cinque and his people. One response was typical of the sympathy the public had for the Africans.
September 11th, 1839. Sirs, a friend of human rights, but no abolitionist, desires your acceptance of the enclosed $5 for the benefit of Joseph Cinque and his African comrades, who nobly liberated themselves from illegal and involuntary bondage.
Roger Sherman Baldwin, a respected Connecticut attorney, agreed to represent the Africans in court. But to President Martin Van Buren, the Amistad Africans were becoming a political thorn that had to be removed.
He just simply wanted to get rid of them. Send them back to Cuba, turn them over to the Spanish, anything in order to get them out of the United States.
The Africans came to trial in January 1840 at the U.S. District Court in Hartford, Connecticut. There was no question that there had been a mutiny aboard the Amistad. But were the Africans now property to be returned to their owners? Or were they human beings with the right to be free? Baldwin argued that since Spain had outlawed the slave trade to Cuba 19 years earlier, the Amistad Africans were never legally slaves at all. During the trial, President Van Buren secretly ordered a U.S. ship, the Grampus, to Connecticut. If the court ruled against the Africans, the Grampus was to return them immediately to Cuba before an appeal could be filed. When the Grampus mission was discovered, reports surfaced of a second vessel that followed the Grampus. This shadow ship, supposedly leased by the abolitionists, would spirit the Africans to Canada if the verdict went against them. The verdict came on January 13, 1840. Judge Andrew Judson's decision shocked everyone. Judson ruled that Cinque and his people were free Negroes of Africa, who had been falsely sold as slaves. He ordered the government to transport them back to their original homelands. But President Van Buren appealed the verdict. The Amistad affair was headed for the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of 1841 met here in this tiny courtroom located in the basement of the U.S. Capitol building. The court was composed mostly of justices who were slaveholders or Southern sympathizers. With the Van Buren administration determined to return the Amistad Africans to Cuba, Cinque and his people didn't need an attorney. They needed a miracle worker. They found him in the person of former President John Quincy Adams.
John Quincy Adams was 73 years old. He was ailing, and he had not tried a case in the Supreme Court in over 30 years. He was reluctant to go to Washington and attempt to handle a case in the court.
One of the children from the Amistad, a 10-year-old boy named Kay Lee, learned enough English to write a letter to Adams and plead for help. Kay Lee's letter was leaked to the press.
Dear friend, Mr. Adams, I want to write a letter to you because you love many people and you talk to the Grand Court. Many people no want to go back to Havana. All we want is make us free. Kaylee.
Adams could not refuse and agreed to represent the Africans, but privately he was deeply worried, as he wrote in his journal.
Oh, how shall I do justice to this case and to these men?
The Supreme Court in 1841 convened in the small basement chamber that was so cramped the justices changed into their robes outside in the hall. Before a packed courtroom, Attorney General Henry Gilpin presented the federal government's position that the Africans were legal property that should be returned to Cuba. Adams countered with arguments for the unconditional release of Cinque and his people.
This court is a court of justice. Justice is the constant and perpetual will to secure to everyone his own rights. These Negroes were free and had a right to assert their liberty.
By a vote of 7-1, the Supreme Court upheld Judson's lower court decision. Justice Joseph Story spoke for the majority.
It is the ultimate right of all human beings in extreme cases to resist oppression and to apply force against ruinous injustice.
John Quincy Adams scribbled a quick, triumphant letter to fellow defense counsel Roger Baldwin.
9 March 1841, noon. Dear Sir, the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of the Amistad has this moment been delivered by Judge Story. The captives are free.
Perhaps for the first time in history, U.S. courts recognized Africans not as property, but as free human beings.
The fact that an African had managed to escape from being enslaved by mutinying on a slave ship, by managing to arrive in a relatively hostile environment, and to be vindicated by the United States legal system, I mean, that was a miracle.
Although the Supreme Court had freed the Africans, it awarded no money to send them home.
What shall be done with the late captives of the Amistad now that by the Supreme Tribunal of the land they have been declared free? John Quincy Adams.
The abolitionist moved Cinque and his people to Farmington, Connecticut, a strong abolitionist town and a major station in the Underground Railroad. They would live there until money could be raised for the return to Africa.
It was very evident the Africans themselves were impatient to return, but the Friends of the Amistad had no money.
Abolitionists took the Africans on fundraising tours. They sang Sunday hymns in New England churches. Cinque astonished one congregation when he ascended to this pulpit in a Connecticut church and read verses from the Bible in English.
And the Lord spoke unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, This saith the Lord, Let my people go.
But months of fundraising and delays had a tragic consequence. One of the Africans, Fune, had reached the end of his patience. In August 1841, Fune walked into a canal lake in Farmington and disappeared into the waters. Like many Africans who were displaced by the slave ships, Fune may have drowned himself because he had decided that it was time to go home.
Friends of the Amistad were moved immensely by Fune's death. That incident pressed them to raise money to get the other Africans home. Eventually, they did raise enough money to charter the British ship the Gentleman and take the Africans back to Sierra Leone.
In January 1842, almost 2 years after the mutiny, Cinque finally brought 34 survivors of the original 53 Amistad Africans home to what is now Sierra Leone in Western Africa. Despite the Africans' victory, renegade ships continued to illegally import African slaves for more than 40 years. It wasn't until 1888, when Brazil outlawed the trade, that the last major slave market in the New World collapsed. The reign of the slave ships ended, leaving the ghosts of 350 years of kidnappings, of packed and hellish slave holds, of disease, death, and violent struggles for freedom, twisting slowly in its wake.
Coming up now, answers to the questions for Slave Ship, Part 2. The European factors worked along the coast of Africa, acting as middlemen who arranged to buy slaves and traded them for other goods. The Amistad decision marked the first time that the United States recognized Africans not as property, but as free human beings. Try this activity with your class. Have students research how the economy changed following the end of slavery. How did this affect the labor force in the United States? To learn more, members of the American Association of School Librarians, ERIC, and Assignment Discovery suggest Amistad by David Pesce. Log on to school.discovery.com for curriculum materials and resources to complement Slave Ship.